The morning of the dispersal sale, there were 19 geese nobody wanted, penned at the far end of the lot behind the good cattle and the sound horses and the shining tractors, in a low wire run that smelled of river mud and old straw, and the crowd that had come with checkbooks and trailers moved past them the way water moves past a stone, and no one stopped, and no one looked, except a woman standing at the rail with her gloves tucked in her back pocket and her hands bare on the cold pipe. Her name was Delia, and she was 27 years old, and she had come home 3 weeks before with a truck that composed its own obituary every time it idled, and a certificate in her jacket she had never once used, and she stood there while the auctioneer worked down the price of the geese from a number to a smaller number to a number that was almost an insult, and still no hand went up, because it was March, and feed was dear, and a goose is loud, and a goose bites, and a goose is not, by the reckoning of that county, worth the corn it eats. She watched them. That was the thing about her that people would later remember and could not at the time explain, that she watched a thing the way other people spent money, with all of her attention and none of her hurry, and she saw what the others did not bother to see, which was that these 19 were not sick and were not thin, that their feathers lay clean and tight, that they held together in the pen like a thing that had been kept together on purpose, that when a boy rattled the fence, the whole grey mass of them turned as one body and faced the sound, necks up, still, watching him back. The auctioneer said he would take $1 a head and be glad of it, and somebody near the coffee truck laughed, and a big man in a clean canvas coat and a good hat said, loud enough to carry, that the only thing those birds were good for was Christmas and coyote suppers, and that whoever bought them was buying 19 funerals and a lot of noise, and a few men laughed with him because he was the kind of man other men laughed with. His name was Wade Coolidge, and he ran 400 acres of good bottom ground and a feedlot and a seat on the co-op board, and he had never in his life been wrong in a way that cost him anything, and when Delia raised one finger off the rail and the auctioneer took it and said sold, Wade Coolidge turned and looked at her for the first time, and looked at the truck behind her, and looked back at the geese, and shook his head slow, the way a man shakes his head at a child who has spent her allowance foolishly, and he said, to her and to everyone, that she would be feeding those things all summer and burying them all winter, and that a goose could not stop a coyote any more than a hymn could, and he said it as a prophecy of her failure, a plain forecast of funerals and dog food and coyote dinners, and I will tell you now, plainly, so you can carry it the way she would come to carry it, that his prediction of failure would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely, that every word of it would come true, in a shape he could not have imagined, and would be made to swallow in front of the whole county. And she did not answer him. She paid $19 in cash from a fold of bills that did not have many more behind it, and she loaded the geese, 2 and 3 at a time, into the bed of the truck under a stretched net, while they hissed and beat their wings, and left long white streaks down her jacket. And she did not hurry, and she did not curse them. And when the last gander stood in the bed with his neck stretched flat and low, and his black eye fixed on Wade Coolidge across the lot, she pulled the net down and tied it off, and got in the truck, and the truck coughed and caught and idled its low complaint, and she drove out past the good cattle and the shining tractors and the men still laughing, and she did not look at them either. And before I take you up the ridge with her, let me stop here for one small thing, because this is the part of the story where a person watching decides whether they are going to stay, and I hope you will stay. And if what you have heard so far has caught you the way it caught me when I first learned it, then do me the small favor of tapping the like, and then down in the comments tell me the name of the town or the city or the country you are watching from right now, because I read every single one, all of them, and it means more than I can say, to see how far a quiet story like this one travels, and to know the exact places it lands. So leave your town, Leave your country, and then come back up the ridge with me, because Delia is nearly home." The road home ran up out of the river bottom and along a ridge and down into a hollow where the family place sat, and she had driven it 1,000 times as a girl and had not driven it in 9 years. And the geese in the bed grew quiet the higher she climbed, settling into the straw, and she watched them in the mirror more than she watched the road, and she thought about none of the things a person might expect her to think about, not the money, and not the man, and not the laughing, but only about the way they had turned together in the pen, all 19, facing the sound, and about a thing her grandfather had said to her once when she was small, and had forgotten until that exact moment on the ridge, with the wind coming through the truck's bad seals, which was that a goose will keep a watch, a dog will not, because a dog loves you, and will forgive a stranger for your sake, and a goose loves nothing, and forgives no one, and remembers every face it has ever seen. And she had laughed at him then, and she did not laugh now. The place, when she came down into the hollow, and the geese lifted their heads at the change in the road, was smaller and greyer than she had carried it in her mind, and emptier, the barn leaning a degree it had not leaned before, the house dark, the yard grown up in last year's dead weeds, standing brittle and pale, and the pond, down past the garden, gone half to reeds. And she sat in the idling truck for a moment and looked at all of it, and then she shut the engine off, and the silence came up around her, the way water comes up around a person who has stopped swimming, total and cold and full of small sounds, the tick of the hot metal, the wind in the dead corn, the low mutter of the geese. She let them out into the yard, and they poured down out of the tailgate in a grey flood and spread across the dead grass, hissing and grumbling and testing the fences and the shadows. And within an hour they had found the pond and taken to it as if they had made it, and she stood on the back step and watched them and did not go inside, because inside was where the emptiness had been waiting the longest. Her grandmother had lived here until the fall, when her heart had quit her in the garden, with a hoe still in her hand, and her mother had died the spring before that, in a city 3 states away, and her grandfather had been gone since Delia was 14, and the life she had built in between, the one the certificate went with, had come apart in a way she did not explain to anyone, and would not explain now, and so she had come back to the one place left, that had a roof and no rent, not because she had a plan, but because she had nowhere else to be, and that is a different thing than a plan, and she knew it. She slept that first night in her grandmother's bed, under quilts that smelled of the woman still, and she woke before light to the sound of the geese setting up a clamour down by the pond, and she went out barefoot in the cold to see what it was, and it was nothing, a possum crossing the yard, and the geese had lined the near bank and put themselves between the possum and the house, and were roaring at it in that flat brass voice they have. And the possum thought better of the whole country, and went back into the weeds, and Delia stood on the step in the dark with her arms wrapped around herself, and watched them settle, and she thought, that is the first thing anyone has done for this house in a year. In the days after she cleaned, she hauled the dead weeds and burned them, she propped the barn and cleared the stove, and washed the years of dust off the windows, and she found the work steadying in the way that only plain work is, that it asked nothing of her but her hands, and gave back in kind, and the geese followed her everywhere she went in the yard, in a loose grey parliament, complaining, curious, and she talked to them without deciding to, low and even, and by the end of the first week they came, when she rattled the feed can, and stood back when she said back, and she had not taught them either thing on purpose. It was in the second week, going through the barn loft for anything that could be sold or burned, that she found the box. It was a wooden ammunition box with a rope handle, gone soft and grey with age, pushed back under the eave behind a broken cradle and a coil of rotten rope, and it was heavier than it looked, and when she pried the swollen lid up, there were ledgers inside, 6 of them, cloth-bound and warped, and a bundle of loose pages tied with waxed string. And on the top ledger in a hand she knew from the fly-leaves of the Bible downstairs, her grandfather's hand, square and slow and pressing hard enough to score the paper, was written a year from before she was born, and under it 2 words underlined twice so hard the pen had torn the page, and the 2 words were, "Keep 6." She did not know what the 2 words meant, "Keep 6", and she set the top ledger aside on the loft floor, in the 1 bar of light that came through the gable vent, and she opened the next one and began to read, and she read in that dusty loft until the light moved off the page, and she had to carry the whole box down to the kitchen table to go on. And what she found in the ledgers was not what she had expected, which had been figures, tallies of cattle and corn and debt, and there were some of those, but mostly what her grandfather had kept, year on year for the better part of 40 years, was a record of the geese. He had numbered them. He had drawn them, crude and careful, marking the patterning of a neck, the set of an eye, the notch in a bill, and beside each drawing he had written in his pressing hand what that bird was, not its weight or its worth, but its nature. This one bolds first, and the rest take heart from her. This one is a liar and sounds off at shadows, cull her before she teaches it. This one is quiet all night and then true, keep her line. He had written that a goose sees in the dark better than a man, and hears a footfall through the ground before it comes to the air, that a gander will die on his feet between his flock, and a thing 3 times his weight, and will not run, that the birds set their own watches and traded them off through the night, in a way he had timed with a pocket watch across 100 nights, and recorded, and there were pages of those times, columns of them. The hour a flock went quiet, and the hour a single sentinel lifted its head. And at the bottom of one such page, he had written the line she would come to say to herself in the dark, that the geese keep the watch, a dog will not. And she sat at the kitchen table, with a cold cup beside her, and read it in his hand, and heard it in his voice, because he had said it to her once on a ridge, and she had laughed. There was a page near the back of the 3rd ledger that stopped her. He had written that the county had gone to wire and lights, and to keeping dogs that a man had to feed meat, and that all of it could be cut or climbed, or fed a poisoned scrap, or simply walked past by a face the dog had been taught to trust, and that a goose could not be cut or climbed, or fed or fooled, because a goose was not a lock and was not a machine. A goose was a living memory that never slept the whole night through, and never forgave a face it had learned to fear, and that a man who kept the right 6 lines of geese kept a thing that could not be bought and could not be broken, and asked only for water and grass, and to be let alone to do the work it was born to do. And then under that, again, the 2 words, "Keep 6", and she understood then that it was not a quantity, but an instruction, that somewhere in the numbered birds there were 6 lines he had chosen out of 40 years of watching. 6 lines he had bred toward the way another man breeds toward milk or muscle, bred toward the wakeful ones and the true-sounding ones and the ones that held the line, and that when the place had passed out of his hands and his flock had been sold off and scattered and drowned in other people's flocks across the county, those lines had gone into the general grey tide of geese that got bought and sold at dispersal sales for $1 a head, and she sat very still, and then she went out into the yard in the last of the light, where the 19 were coming up from the pond in their loose parliament, complaining, and she looked at them differently than she had looked at anything in a long time, because she was looking for 6. It took her the rest of that first spring to learn to read them, and she went about it the way her grandfather had, with a pocket notebook she carried in the breast pocket of the chore jacket, and a pencil she kept sharp with her knife, and she sat out in the yard in the evenings, when the light was long and low, and she watched the geese the way you would watch a language you were learning, and she wrote down what she saw. She wrote which of them lifted a head first when a truck came down the ridge road, and which of them went to the sound, and which of them went away from it, and which one, a big pale gander with a notch in his bill, that she began to think of as an old wound, and later matched to a drawing in the second ledger her grandfather had made 40 years before, would put himself between the flock and any new thing without fail, every time, and hold there with his neck flat and low until the thing had gone or been named safe. She wrote down the hours. She sat up whole nights on the back step with a blanket and a thermos, and her grandfather's columns open on her knee, timing the flock against the dark, and she found that he had been exactly right, that they set watches, that the flock went quiet a little after full dark, and that all through the night there was always one head up, always one, and that the watch changed hands in a way she could not have designed, and could not fully predict, but could, after enough nights, begin to feel coming, and she wrote the times down beside his times, from 4 decades gone, and the columns matched so closely that twice she had to stop and put the pencil down and sit with it. By the end of the 3rd week she could tell them apart at a glance. By the end of the 5th week she could tell them apart in the dark by voice. By the end of the 7th week she had found her 6, the pale notched gander, and a grey goose that was quiet all night and then true, and a young gander that bolded first and gave the rest their nerve, and 3 more whose lines ran back through the drawings to birds her grandfather had marked "Keep her line," and she penned those 6 apart and let the other 13 keep the yard, and she began, without quite admitting to herself that this was now a thing she was doing, to breed toward the watch. Word of the geese got down the ridge before she did anything to send it, because that is how word goes in a place like that. And the way it went was through Nadine at the fuel and feed, who pumped the diesel and sold the salt blocks and the fence staples, and knew everything that happened in the hollow before the people it happened to had finished happening it. And Nadine told it as a joke, the way it had started at the sale, that the Ford girl had come home and bought 19 geese for $19, and was living up in that dead place alone with a flock of geese and no cattle and no plan. And the joke got a good run at the counter for a few weeks. Wade Coolidge kept it alive. He came in for his feed and his talk, and he would ask Nadine, loud, how the goose ranch was getting on, and whether the coyotes had catered their own supper yet, and whether a body could get goose down insulation up at the Ford place, or just a lot of noise for free. And the men at the counter laughed, because he was the kind of man they laughed with, and Nadine laughed too, and then repeated all of it up the ridge, so that the mockery reached Delia second-hand, softened and hardened both by the retelling, and she took it the way she took most things, which was without a word. She came into the fuel and feed for staples and salt one afternoon in the first summer, with the dust of the road on her, and her braid over one shoulder, and the scar over her eyebrow catching the light, and Wade Coolidge was at the counter, and he asked her, grinning, how many funerals she'd had, and she counted out her staples onto the counter and said, none, and he said, give it a winter, and she looked at him with those dark, steady eyes and said, that's one approach, and paid Nadine and left, and Wade Coolidge laughed, but it did not carry quite as far as it usually did, because there is a particular way a quiet person can answer a loud one that takes the air out of the room, and she had it, and she did not even seem to know she had it. The first proof was small, the way the first proof always is, and it came in the deep of that first summer, on a night so hot the house would not let go of the day, and Delia had taken her blanket out to the back step, as she did most nights now, and she was half asleep against the doorframe, a little after 2 in the morning, when the 6 she had penned apart went off all at once. Not the loose grumbling of a possum or a shadow, but a hard, flat wall of brass sound, the whole voice of them thrown at one point in the dark down past the garden, and the pale notched gander was at the wire, with his neck flat and low, and his wings half open, and Delia was off the step and across the yard, before she was fully awake, and what she found in the beam of her light was a man. He was young and thin, and not from the hollow, and he had come up the creek in the dark on foot with a feed sack, the kind of man who works the back roads in a dry summer, taking what is not nailed down, a coil of copper, a chainsaw off a porch, a can of diesel, and he had gotten as far as the edge of the garden and no farther, because 6 geese had found him in the dark before he had made a sound, and had thrown their whole voice at him and lit the whole hollow with it. And he stood there, frozen in her light, with the empty sack in his hand, and the geese roaring, and she did not point a gun at him because she did not have one in her hand. She pointed the light, and she said, "You should go." And he went, back down the creek at a run, with the geese seeing him off the length of the fence, and in the morning she found where he had cut her Fargate chain and left it, and she mended the chain and wrote the night down in her notebook, the hour and the direction, and the fact that it had been the penned 6 and not the yard flock that took him, and she did not tell anyone, because there was no one to tell, and because it was not yet, she felt, a thing that had proved itself, only a thing that had happened once. But the man told. He told it down at the county seat where such men drink, that he had gone up a dead hollow after copper, and been run off by a flock of geese that came out of the pure dark, without a light or a dog or a sound of warning, until they were on him, and the story travelled, changed, and came back around the long way to the fuel and feed, as a kind of ghost story, and Nadine told it. And for the first time the telling did not have a laugh at the bottom of it, only a strangeness, and Wade Coolidge, when he heard it, said that a spooked drifter would run from a barking squirrel, and that it proved nothing, and he was, in the narrow way, right, and Delia would have agreed with him, because she was not a person who overvalued a single night. She went on through that first summer, and into the fall, breeding toward the watch, hatching the 6's eggs under her own care, and reading every keat against her grandfather's drawings, culling the lyres that sounded off at shadows, because he had told her to cull them before they taught it, keeping the quiet then true ones, keeping the ones that bolded first. And by the second spring she had 30 birds and a real flock inside the flock, a line of them, and she had begun to sell the excess, not as meat, which is what a goose is worth in that county, but as watch geese, 6 at a time, to people who had a thing worth watching, and had heard the story, a peach grower 2 hollows over, who was losing fruit to thieves in the night, a woman alone on a mountain road, a small distillery that could not keep copper on the place, and she priced them fairly, and she went herself to set them, and she taught the people how to read them, and every place she set a 6, the taking in the night stopped, and none of it was advertised, and all of it moved by word, hollow to hollow, the way her grandfather's line had once scattered, and now, in reverse, began to gather itself back. The elder in the story was not dead, and this is the part Delia had not let herself hope for, because when she had come home, she had believed herself the last of them, but her grandfather's sister still lived, an old woman named Ada who was near 90, and had a room in the county home 20 miles off, and Delia had not gone to see her in the first raw months, because she had not been able to go anywhere she would have to be a person in front of. But in the second summer, with the geese proving themselves and the ledgers half memorized, she drove the 20 miles and found the old woman by a window with a lapful of peas she was shelling one at a time into a bowl. And Ada looked at her a long moment and said her mother's name, which was wrong, and then said her name, which was right, and then went back to the peas. Delia sat with her. She had brought the top ledger, and she opened it on the bed to the underlined line, "Keep 6, and she asked the old woman if she knew what it meant, and Ada shelled a pea and dropped it in the bowl and said, without looking up, that her brother had built the wrong kind of barn on purpose, low and open at the eaves where any sensible man would have closed it, so the geese could get up under it and see out and be seen, and that everyone had told him it was a fool's barn, and he had let them, and that the geese had kept that place through the worst years without a dog or a gun or a lock, kept it through the year men were taking anything that would sell, kept it through a night Ada would not describe, past saying that 2 men had come up the creek, and that in the morning her brother had mended the gate, and said nothing to the law, because the geese had already said everything that needed saying. And she said that when he got old and the place got to be too much and it all went at the sale, he had stood at the rail and watched his lines go for $1 a head to men who would eat them or drown them, and that he had come home and written "Keep 6" in the front of the book and made her promise that if ever one of them came back to the place, they would be told, and that she had waited so long to tell it, she had near forgot she carried it. And she looked up from the peas at last, and looked at Delia's jacket, the streaked chaw coat, and at her hands, and she said, "He built that barn for these," and she said it flat, as a fact offered for consideration. And then she said one more thing, that she had known Delia would come back before Delia had, and she did not explain how, and she went back to the peas. And that was the most she said that day, and near the most she ever said at once, because Ada said 1/10 of what she thought, and let the rest sit. Delia drove home in the dark, with the ledger on the seat beside her, and did not turn the radio on, and when she came down into the hollow, the geese heard the truck, and set up their low welcome from the pond, and she stood in the yard a long time before she went in. She went to see Ada every week after that. She would bring the notebook and read the old woman the week, the hatch counts and the culls and the 6s she had set out across the county and where, and Ada would shell her peas or mend a sock, and say almost nothing, and once when Delia read her that she had sold a 6 to a man clear over the ridge in the next county, who ran a vineyard and had lost a season's fruit to night pickers, Ada stopped her needle and said, "Those are the ones," meaning something Delia did not fully understand and did not ask about. The ones worth keeping, the ones worth setting, the ones her brother had bred toward, and she said it, as if it were the plain truth of the matter, and Delia wrote it down. The old woman withheld her praise so completely that when a piece of it came, it landed like a stone dropped in a still pond, and it came only once that whole 2nd year, on an afternoon when Delia had told her a thing about the pale notched gander, how he stood his watch every 3rd night without fail, and gave it over to the young gander at the same hour each time, and Ada listened and shelled her peas and then said, "Quiet, you have his eye," meaning her brother's, and she did not say anything else, and Delia had to look out the window for a while, and Ada let her, and shelled her peas, and that was all. The winter of the 2nd year was the hard one, the one that came down early and cruel out of the northwest, with an ice storm that took the power out for 9 days across 3 counties, and dropped limbs the size of a man's leg across every road in the hollow, and it was in the black middle of that winter, at 3:26 in the morning by the wind-up clock on the kitchen wall that had kept time all through the outage while everything electric in the county sat dead, that the geese sounded the alarm that made the story a story, and Delia would remember the hour exactly, because she looked at that clock the moment her feet hit the cold floor. She had been asleep under every quilt in the house, with the stove banked low, and the alarm that woke her was not the possum grumble, and was not even the hard flat wall of the drifter night. It was worse than either. It was the whole flock, the yard birds and the penned 6 together, the full voice of 30 geese thrown at the house itself, at the barn, at something close, and under the brass of them, she heard the other thing, the thing that had set them off, a sound she knew in her body before she named it, the low breathing crackle of fire. The ice had brought a limb down across the service line to the barn in the night, and the line had lain sparking in the wet straw under the low, open eave her grandfather had built wrong on purpose, and the straw had smouldered slow, for who knows how long in the dark, and had just come up into open flame when the wind found it, and the geese, up under that eave, where they could see out and be seen, where they had gone to roost out of the ice, exactly as her grandfather had built the barn for them to do, had smelled it and seen it before it was anything, and had thrown their whole voice at the house until they brought her out of the deepest sleep of the coldest night of the year. And she came off the step into the yard in her sock feet, and saw the orange light climbing the inside of the barn wall, and did not stop to think. She ran. She got the hydrant by the barn cracked open, the one on the deep well that ran on no power at all, and she got the long hose on it, that she kept there for no reason she could have named except that her grandfather's ledgers had a page about where water had to be able to reach without a pump, and she fought that fire in the dark, in the ice in her sock feet, with 30 geese roaring behind her, and driving up out of the barn past her in a grey storm of wings. And she got it. Barely. She got it down to steam and char, before it took the loft, before it took the whole barn and the house, 40 feet beyond it, and everything her grandfather had built, and her grandmother had kept, and she had come home to. And when it was out, and she was standing in the wet black ruin of one corner, with the hose still running, and her feet gone numb past feeling, she understood, standing there shaking, that if the geese had slept the way a dog sleeps, the way she slept, she would have woken to a wall of fire, or not woken at all, and that the birds no one at the sale had wanted, the 19 funerals, the coyote suppers, had just kept the watch that no dog and no wire and no lock had been keeping, and had kept it at 3:26 in the morning in the dead middle of the worst night of the year, exactly as an old man had written down that they would, in a book that had waited 40 years in a box under an eave for someone to read it. And she thought, standing in the char, of Wade Coolidge at the rail, saying she would be feeding those things all summer and burying them all winter. And she understood then that he had spoken truer than he knew, that his prophecy of a funeral had come around backward and stood the whole thing on its head, that the funeral he had promised her had turned out to be a prediction of something else entirely, the funeral of the barn and the house and the place that did not happen, the burying that the geese refused to let the winter do. The story of the fire did not stay in the hollow, because a thing like that cannot, and it went down the ridge to the fuel and feed the way everything did. But this time it did not go as a joke, and it did not go as a ghost story. It went as a plain account of what had happened, that the Ford girls' geese had smelled a wire fire in an ice storm and raised the alarm and saved the place, while every dog in the county slept and every alarm in the county sat dead with the power. And Nadine told it straight, without a laugh at the bottom, and the men at the counter did not laugh either. And when Wade Coolidge came in for his feed a few days after, and made to start in on the goose ranch the way he always did, the counter did not go with him, and he felt it, and he let the thing die in his mouth half said, and that was the first crack in him, though he would not have called it that. He was not a bad man, Wade Coolidge. And this is a thing the story has to be fair about. He was a loud man, and a certain man, and a man who had never been wrong, in a way that cost him, and those are different things than bad. And when his own turn came, it came the following summer, the dry one, when the back roads filled again with the kind of men who take what is not nailed down, and Wade Coolidge lost a full spool of new copper wire off his feedlot in the night, and then a week later near lost a good horse to a gate left open by someone who had been in his lot in the dark, and he put up lights and he put up cameras, and he got a dog, a big loud dog that loved him, and still the taking went on, because a light can be avoided, and a camera watches a thing after it is already gone, and a dog can be fed a scrap over a fence by a patient hand. And Wade Coolidge, who had said out loud in front of the whole sale that a goose could not stop a coyote any more than a hymn could, drove up the ridge into the hollow one evening in the second dry summer with his good hat in his hand, and Delia was in the yard mending the fence of the Six's pen, with her gloves on and her braid over her shoulder, and she stood up when his truck came down, and wiped her hands and waited. And he got out and stood there a minute, with the geese lined along the wire watching him, the pale notched gander flat and low, remembering his face from a sail lot 3 years gone. And Wade Coolidge looked at that gander, looking at him, and then looked at her, and said, "I was wrong," and he did not make a large production out of it. He said it the way a man pays a debt he has been carrying too long, plainly, once, and he asked her, would she sell him 6, and would she come and set them, and teach him to read them? And she looked at him a while, with those steady dark eyes, and then she said, "They remember faces, he'll know you now." And Wade Coolidge said, "I'd guess he would," and something passed between them that was not quite friendship and was more than a truce. And she sold him 6, and she went and set them, and the taking on his place stopped that month, and did not start again, and he never said another word against the geese as long as he lived. And when men at the Fuel and Feed asked him about it, he would say only that he had been wrong, and that a man ought to be able to say so. And the story of Wade Coolidge saying I was wrong went around the county the same way his mockery had, through Nadine, hollow to hollow, and it did as much for Delia as the fire had, because in a place like that, the correction of a proud man is worth more than the praise of 100 quiet ones. By the 3rd year she had a real line of geese and a real trade in them, watch 6s going out across 3 counties, and then 4, moving by word alone, never once advertised, and buyers who came to her did not come for a bird that a man could buy anywhere but for her line, the wakeful and the true, and the ones that held, bred back 40 years toward an old man's underlined instruction, and she kept her prices fair, and she kept her growth slow, only as fast as the hatch would bear, and when the bank down at the county seat sent a man up the ridge to offer her money to grow the thing faster, a barn and incubators and more ground, she listened to him the whole way through, and then said, no. And when he asked why, she said a thing her grandfather had written in the 6th ledger that she had come to hold as her own. That debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and she would not tell the future what to do. She would let the work say how fast the work could go, and the bankman did not understand her, and drove back down the ridge, and she went back to the fence. Ada died in the fall of the 3rd year, quietly, in the chair by the window, with a lapful of half-shelled peas, and the bowl on the sill, and the county home called Delia in the morning, and Delia drove the 20 miles, and sat with the old woman a while before they came for her, and Ada had left a thing for her, the aide said, had been particular about it in her last weeks, and it was a sealed envelope with Delia's name on it, in a hand gone spidery and slow, but still, at the root of it, her brother's hand taught to a sister, 80 years gone. And Delia did not open it there. She carried it home, on the seat beside her, the way she had carried the ledger, and she buried Ada 3 days later, in the family ground up on the ridge beside her brother and her mother and the rest, and the whole hollow came, which is a thing Delia had not expected, and stood a little apart from, until it came to her that she was not standing apart from it any more, that she was in it, that the people filing up the ridge road were her people now, whether she had chosen it or not. Nadine came from the Fuel and Feed, and the peach grower from 2 hollows over, and the woman from the mountain road, and the man with the vineyard from the next county, and Wade Coolidge came in a black coat, and stood at the back with his hat in his hands and did not say much, and the boy came, a boy named Eli, who was 14, and had been coming up to the place all that 3rd summer to help her with the hatch for a small wage, a quiet, watchful boy, from a hard house down the creek, who had turned out to have a thing with the birds that could not be taught, who could read a keat at a week old and tell her which was a liar and which would hold. And Ada had met him just the once, in the summer, when Delia had brought him along on a visit, and the old woman had looked at the boy over her peas the whole time, and said nothing until they were leaving, and then had said to Delia at the door, Lo, that one, he's got the hands, and Delia had written it down. She opened the envelope that night at the kitchen table, with the geese quiet down at the pond, and the wind-up clock ticking on the wall, and inside was a single sheet in Ada's spidery hand, and it said that the place was hers now free and clear, that the old woman had held the deed all these years and had signed it over, and under that, in a line the old woman must have gathered all her failing strength to press hard the way her brother pressed hard, were 3 words that were not, "Keep 6," and were not, "Those are the ones," but were the thing behind both of them. And the 3 words were, "Pass it on," and Delia sat with that a long time in the lamplight, and then she folded it and put it in the front of the top ledger beside the 2 underlined words, and in the morning she went out to the barn, where Eli was already at work on the hatch, early, the way he always came early, and she watched him a while from the door the way her grandfather had watched, and the way she had learned to watch, and she saw him lift a weak keat and hold it against his neck to warm it without being told, and she came in and stood beside him and said, "When I'm gone, this is yours, the place and the line and the book." And the boy looked up at her, startled, and she said, "You have the hands." And he did not know what to say, and so said nothing, which was the right thing, and she put him to work, and she began, that winter, to teach him to read the ledgers the way Ada had taught her nothing, and the birds had taught her everything, and the loop that her grandfather had opened 40 years before, with 2 underlined words, began, at last, to close. The 4th year came around the way the 4th year does, in a rush now, the days that had once gone hour by hour, going by in whole seasons, and the place that had been dead, when she drove down into it with 19 geese in the bed of a dying truck, was not dead anymore. The barn mended and re-roofed where the fire had eaten it. The low, wrong eaves rebuilt exactly as they had been, because she understood now why they were wrong. The pond cleared, the house lit, the yard full of the low grey parliament, of a line of geese bred back to an old man's mark, and Delia herself at the centre of it, olive-skinned and wiry and sure, her braid gone a little longer over the shoulder of the same rust-brown chore jacket, now worn near through at the elbows, the scar over her eyebrow the same, her hands harder, her eyes the same steady dark, and she had become, without ever once trying to become anything, a person the county spoke of, with the particular quiet respect it kept for people who had been proven right slowly, which is the only way that respect is ever really earned. And there was a morning in the spring of that 4th year, the anniversary near enough of the 1st, when the same auction house held the same dispersal sale down in the river bottom, and Delia drove down to it, not because she needed anything, but because she had come to do a thing she had been turning over all winter, and the lot was the same, the good cattle, and the sound horses, and the shining tractors up front, and the neglected things at the back that nobody wanted, and at the very back, in the same low-wire run that smelled of river mud, there was a lot of geese, a scattered grey mixed lot of 40 birds off a place that had gone under, and the crowd moved past them, the way water moves past a stone, and no one stopped, and no one looked, and the auctioneer worked the price down from a number to a smaller number, to a number that was almost an insult, and Delia stood at the rail with her gloves in her back pocket and her bare hands on the cold pipe, and watched them, and she saw, in the middle of that unwanted grey tide, the way a whole knot of them turned as one body, to face a rattled fence, necks up, still, watching, and she knew what she was looking at, because she had spent 4 years learning to see it. She was looking at a line, somebody's lost bred line gone into the general tide, wakeful and true and holding, worth nothing to anyone in that whole crowd but her. And when the auctioneer said he would take $1 a head and be glad of it, and somebody near the coffee truck laughed, Delia raised one finger off the rail, And the auctioneer took it and said sold, and she paid $40 in cash from a fold of bills that had a great deal more behind it now than it once had, and she loaded the geese, 2 and 3 at a time, into the bed of a truck that no longer composed its own obituary at idle, because she could afford a better one now, and had kept the old one anyway out of a loyalty she did not explain. And Wade Coolidge was there, older, quieter, and he came and stood at the rail beside her, while she loaded, and did not offer to help, because he understood by now that she did not need help. And he watched her tie off the net over 40 unwanted geese, and he said, more to himself than to her, "Funny how a thing nobody wants turns out to be the only thing worth having, when a body knows how to look at it." And she said, "That's one approach," and he laughed. An old man's laugh with no meanness left in it at all, and she got in the truck and drove up out of the river bottom and along the ridge and down into the hollow, with the geese growing quiet the higher she climbed. And Eli was waiting in the yard when she came down, 16 now and tall, and he opened the tailgate, and the 40 poured out in a grey flood into the yard, where they were met and questioned by the line already there. And Delia stood on the back step and watched the 2 flocks sort themselves in the long, low light, and she thought about none of the things a person might expect, not the money, and not the man, and not the years, but only about the way they had turned together in the pen to face the sound, all of them, and about an old man on a ridge who had told her a truth she had laughed at, and about the thing that had settled onto her shoulders in these 4 years, the way a coat settles, the weight of a place and a line and a promise, pass it on, and it was not triumph she felt, or if it was something older and quieter than triumph. The feeling of a person who had been told what she carried was worth nothing, and had lived long enough and watched close enough to see the world come around and correct itself, and she stood there in it as long as it lasted, and did not perform any of it. And then she went down off the step into the yard to help the boy carry water, because the geese needed water, and that was the work, and the work said how fast the work could go. If you have watched this far, do this one small thing for me. Share this story with someone who has been underestimated, someone who was told the thing they loved was worth nothing. And down in the comments, tell me about the stubborn thing in your own life that people laughed at. The thing you kept anyway, because I read every single one. And somewhere out there right now, there is a person standing at a back rail looking at the lot nobody wants, and seeing what no one else can see, and the geese are keeping the watch a dog will not, and the ground remembers, and worth does not need to argue, because in the end, given enough patience and enough quiet, and enough years, it simply proves itself.